Well, last week we began a new series called Perfectly Imperfect. Regardless of your past, regardless of your circumstances, what you've been through, where you've come from, what's happened to you, none of that matters to God. What matters to Him is your surrender, your authenticity, and your relationship with Him, the status of your heart and your willingness to follow His lead. Sometimes the most remarkable stories in kingdom work comes from those that the world deems unworthy, or those that are held to a human standard don't seem like folks that God would ever use and bless. Last week we spoke of Hagar, the Egyptian slave that was the first person God called by name in Scriptures and the first person who gave God a name. She became pregnant by Abram in he and Sarai's attempt to fulfill God's promise on their own, and became an outcast and sent into the desert twice. We found that there is a God who sees us in the midst of our messiness. Whether we are victims of abuse or pregnant teenagers with nowhere to turn, whether we've been disowned by our families or we've given up hope, no matter what our situation, we never lose hope in the promise that in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loves us. We always need to remember that our God is the same God who saw Hagar in her distress. He is our God who sees. He knows every nook and cranny of your emotions and your life and your situation, and He is there with you and for you. And today we get to speak of Ruth, from one of the most beautifully written books in all of Scriptures. Ruth is the story of family and companionship and selflessness. Ruth was not a Jew. She was from Moab, which was a pagan society. Moabites were some wicked, polytheistic people, the total opposite of the Jewish culture. Nonetheless, Ruth set on a journey as a widow alongside her mother-in-law Naomi, a Jew, to go back to the land of her people, the Israelites, and finds all sorts of unexpected healing and blessings, which we'll get to as we dive into the text today. And although the book of Ruth is only 4 chapters, it would be very difficult and long to go through it verse by verse, which I typically like to do. So instead of doctrinal expository or verse-by-verse preaching, today we're going to do what they call narrative expository preaching. I get to tell the story. It's a beautiful story. But before we get to the story, let me remind you, as Christians and as sons and daughters of the Most High, one of the things that we always have to do is look for the good. We always have to look for the good. Based on the state of the world, the impeding wars, our godless society, and our cultural downfalls, where is the good? Where is the perfect God? What is the perfect God doing among His imperfect people? Romans 8:28 reminds us that God works all things for the good for those who love Him, right? God always provides a thread of redemption. There is always a promise kept. There is always signs that all will be right. Let's look at World War II, for example. On the potential doorstep of World War III, let's talk about World War II. Since everybody knows the human tragedy of 6 million Jews killed, almost 700,000 American soldiers killed, collectively from all countries, an estimated 60 million people were killed during that war. Against that backdrop and against that darkness and that sadness and that horrid human behavior, how sweet is the story of Corrie ten Boom, who became part of the Dutch underground resistance network and oversaw a network of smuggling Jews to safe places. All in all, she and her family helped about 800 Jews be saved and not lose their life through this underground railroad. Always look for the good. Not an easy thing to do when we're overwhelmed, right? It's really hard to think positively and to move forward when we're treading water and we're just trying to stay alive. Paul gives us great advice on this in Philippians 4, verse 8, where he says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think on those things." You will always see what you're focused on. You may remember me sharing with you that our brains are like computers. Our brains don't know right from wrong. They don't rationalize, they compute. I never in my life saw a plaid blue Cadillac SRX until I bought one. And now I see plaid blue Cadillac SRXs all the time, right? It's a confirmation. Our brains are going, oh yeah, there it is. Oh yeah, there it is. Oh yeah, there it is. So when it comes to our emotions, our paradigms, and our worldviews, our brain will work very hard to prove what we think. So if we have a negative outlook, a nasty attitude, a pessimistic spirit, a doubtful heart, our brains will find everything it can to prove that to be true. And if we dwell on what is true and what is noble and what is right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, well, our brains will find ways to show that to be true as well. One of my favorite life quotes is, attitude precedes perception. And as children of God, sons and daughters of the Most High, we are safely in His grasp. We have nothing to fear, and we can focus our hearts, thoughts, and emotions on all the good. We can always look for the good, and we can see the redemptive work of our God in every single situation. A difficult book of the Bible, because of its rawness and its harshness, is the book of Judges. Now, there's some really great stories in there. One of my favorites is the story of Samson. Deborah was a strong woman. Gideon was the reluctant judge. But even those stories had a lot of tensions and stress. Overall, Judges is very dark and it's very moody. Harsh stories like the cutting up of a body, and the son of a prostitute was driven out of his home and seeks revenge and makes an insane promise in which his daughter was condemned to die. Judges should be read because it is raw history of Israel before the kings, but it's hard and it raises a lot of questions, and it shows the dirtiness and the nastiness of humanity. And the book of Ruth follows Judges. A delightful and fun book compared to the gloomy Judges. And I always thought that Ruth actually took place after all of that darkness, but it didn't. It actually happened during the story of Judges. Ruth 1:1 says, in the day when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So we know it's in the day of Judges, the previous book. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Turns out the story of Ruth really actually did take place on probably early on in the book of Judges. And Ruth is a glimmer of the good work of our Lord in the dark and rough times of the Judges. Remember, we always need to look for the good, and Ruth is a shining example of that. Let's read through verses 2 through 5 to get the premise of the story. Sorry, I got to say it right all the time. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from the Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Eesh. So now there are 3 childless widows. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Now understand the cultural context here. To be a childless widow was among the lowest, most disadvantaged classes in the ancient world. There was no one to support you, and you had to live on the generosity of strangers. Naomi had no family in Moab, and no one else to help her. It was a desperate situation. So, from all the way in the pagan world of Moab, Naomi heard that God was doing great things back in Israel. She wanted to be a part of the good things that God was doing and set her heart back on going home. Verse 7 tells us that they went on their way to return to Israel. This set Naomi apart from many people, because even people of today hear the good things of God and see the good things that He's doing in the lives of others, but only wish that they could have some of it, and they don't do anything about it. Naomi could have stayed in Moab all of her life, wishing that things were different, dreaming of life back in Israel, but she didn't. She took action. Faith is action. Action is stewardship. Now, Naomi does what she thinks best, and she advises that her daughter-in-laws stay in Moab, near their homes and their families and what they knew. Makes sense, right? This was the wise thing to do. Orpah and Ruth had stronger family ties in Moab than they did with Naomi. And so it made sense for them to stay there instead of going to this new distant land that they've never lived, Israel, with Naomi. Life as a single, childless widow is difficult anywhere in this culture. Exceptional in Israel. Let me jump to verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and Ruth clung to her. Both Orpah and Ruth felt deeply. I mean, you got to think of the emotions here. Like, all their husbands are dead. They have no idea what they're going to do. All they have is each other. They love each other deeply. They're feeling deeply. They're anxious about the future, but a choice had to be made. Orpah chose to stay in Moab, and Ruth clung to Naomi. Clung to her. There comes a place in our following after God that comes down to doing, right? Ruth and Orpah felt the same things, but Ruth did differently than Orpah. She physically clung to Naomi. And in verses 16 and 17, Ruth insists that she stays. Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Isn't that beautiful? Selfless. This was more than a change of address. Ruth was willing to forsake the Moabite life and the gods that she grew up with and embrace this God of Israel. She was deciding to follow the Lord of Lords. This Gentile woman, once far from God, had drawn near to him through Naomi. This shows us that Naomi's relationship with God had a tremendous impact on Ruth, right? This is striking because Naomi did not have an easy life. Ruth watched Naomi go through all of this bad stuff and being widowed and losing her children. She believed that she even caused the calamity by her own disobedience. Yet she still honored and loved her God. This impacted Ruth in a powerful way. Your faith in your God, despite your circumstances, impact the people of your life in a powerful way. People should go and be able to look at your life just as Ruth looked at Naomi's and say, I want your God to be my God. Your trust in God and turning towards Him in tough times will often be the same thing that draws others to the Lord. So the two of them set off together. And chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they'll get some food. We're here now. How are we going to eat? The two women with no resources, no man in this patriarchal society, they needed to eat. Naomi comes up with a plan for Ruth to glean in the fields. They were related to this guy named Boaz, who they were related through Elimelech, and Scripture says that Boaz was a worthy man of noble character. Who is this dude? We'll find out shortly. And Ruth and the Moabites said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So what is gleaning? Anybody ever glean in their life? I was waiting for some farmers to say, yeah, I got it. Gleaning is picking up the harvest that has fallen from the ground after the workers have gone through the crops. So they've gone through, they've picked out their bounty and what they're going to eat, what they're going to sell, what they're going to give their families, and whatever is left on the vine or whatever has fallen on the ground is open for anybody to take. It's actually a law that came from the Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Farmers should leave the edges of their fields unharvested and should not pick up anything that was dropped. That is the gleanings. And they should not harvest any overlooked produce that has been forgotten when they harvested the majority of the field. And this was to help travelers, the poor, and the marginalized folks of society. This made sure everybody got to eat. Ruth goes to glean in Boaz's field, but he notices her and inquires of her. After finding more about her story, he shows remarkable grace and care and makes provisions for Ruth to gather more grains. Boaz, in fact, is so impressed with Ruth that he says in verses 11 through 13, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz says, "I see you, and my God will bless you because of your faith." Right from the jump, he's saying this. Boaz encouraged Ruth as if she were a new covenant, or a new convert, if she was a new convert to the God of Israel. And in many ways, Ruth stands before us just as an example of someone who just finds Jesus in today's world, right? She put her trust in the God of Israel. She left her former associates and she left her family. She's come to a land of strangers. She was very low in her own eyes. She found protection under the wings of God. So in the same way, older, seasoned Christians should be like Boaz to younger Christians who are like Ruth. Too often we see in our world the gumption and the excitement and the zeal that new believers have. And they push the limits and they shake people up. And seasoned believers are like, "Well, yeah, shut up already. Stop acting like that. That's not what we do." And they get negative and they get nasty and they shut them down instead of being gentle with them, confirming their faith and teaching them and ushering them into a beautiful way of life, into the true living as a son and daughter of the Most High. It's been a few weeks since I have a Spurgeon quote. A few people noticed. Thank you for noticing. But Spurgeon quotes are back as of today. "Observe that he saluted her with the words of tender encouragement. For this is precisely what I want all the elder Christians among you to do to those who are the counterparts of Ruth. I want you to make a point of looking out for young converts and speaking to them goodly words and comfortable words, whereby they may be cheered and strengthened." So good. So after this conversation with Boaz, Ruth returns home to Naomi with the bounty of her gleaning and the generosity of Boaz and tells Naomi about the day. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law in whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours. He's one of our redeemers." Naomi encourages Ruth to stay close to the woman working under Boaz and to stay connected to him, for he is a redeemer for the family. The importance of that will unfold as the story continues. Naomi begins to feel something. Her faith is starting to be confirmed, knowing that she did the right thing. She's starting to see the good. She is starting to believe that her family has a future again. And we go on to chapter 3, and it begins with Naomi and Ruth creating a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. It can be assumed that over a period of harvest, Ruth and Boaz got to know each other pretty well. They got to see each other's heart, their nature. They spent a lot of time together. They were seeing what kind of person each other was and how they interacted amongst a large group. And Ruth, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor.'" Naomi knew that Ruth could best be taken care of if she was married, so she suggested that she appeal to Boaz. She tells Ruth to take off of her grieving clothes and to put on some nice clothes and some fine oils, be smelling good, be looking good, and you go meet Boaz on the threshing floor. Now, this word for security here in verse 1 is the same word that was used in Ruth 1:9, where Naomi hoped that her daughter-in-laws would find rest and security in the home of a new husband. Same context, same Hebrew word, rest and security in a husband. The Hebrew word speaks of what a home should be, a place of rest and security. Now, one might easily think that this was inappropriate of Naomi to suggest this to Ruth, because we have eyes from our culture. It is possible to think that Naomi plotted with Ruth to make a man trap, right? To go out and to hunt down a reluctant Boaz for marriage and to trap him in. But that's not what happened. Naomi's suggestion to Ruth was rooted in a custom of the ancient Israelites, the meaning behind the Hebrew word goel. This was the point in Naomi's question about Boaz. Is he not our relative? She reminded Ruth and Boaz that their family, that Boaz was their family goel. This goel, sometimes translated into kinsman redeemer, had a special defined role in the Israelites' life. The kinsman redeemer was responsible to buy a fellow Israelite out of slavery, as it says in Leviticus 25. He was responsible to be the avenger of blood, to make sure the murderer of a family answered to the crime in Numbers 35. He was responsible to buy back family land that had been forfeited in Leviticus 25. And he was responsible to carry on the family name by marrying the childless widow in Deuteronomy 25. You see, since Boaz was recognized goel for the family of Elimelech, the deceased husband of Naomi and the father-in-law of Ruth, Ruth could appeal to him to be her safeguard, to be the kinsman redeemer, and to take her in marriage. It may seem very forward and countercultural to us, but it was regarded as proper in that day. So after this conversation with Naomi, Ruth heads to the farm and ends up having a conversation with Boaz. And she asks if Boaz will redeem her family and marry her. Boaz is amazed at the heart and the loyalty of Ruth. And again, he talks about it. He calls her a wonderful woman of noble character. The same term here for noble character is the term in the Hebrew word used in the description of the Proverbs 31 woman. Boaz says in verses 11 through 13, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet," hold your horses, "there is a redeemer nearer than I." There's another dude, so hold your horses. "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Get some rest. You will be safe and protected. I got this." So, apparently, through Boaz, though Boaz was the recognized goel towards Ruth, there was another goel closer in relation to the deceased Elimelech. So Boaz could not exercise this right as kinsman redeemer unless the closer kinsman redeemer relinquished his rights towards Ruth. And again, let this be an example of the kind of man Boaz was. Boaz is a true man of integrity, and he wasn't going to cut corners. He loved Ruth, and he wanted to be that for her, but there is a proper way to do things, and we're going to make sure we do it the right way. He knew that if it was really of the Lord, then it could be done orderly and in the way it was supposed to. So in the morning, he sends Ruth home with some food. Y'all need to eat. 6 ephahs of grain to be exact. Boaz, being the gentleman that he was, wouldn't send Ruth home empty-handed, right? And cool side note here, we don't know if this is true, but in Jewish traditions, it is said that the 6 measures of barley that was given to Ruth was a sign of the 6 pious men who would descend from her, endowed with 6 spiritual gifts: David, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and our King Jesus. Cool little side note, right? Boaz meets with the other kinsman redeemer, the one closer to the family than Boaz. He goes to handle business. And he says to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of my elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I will come after you. And the man said, I will redeem it. Boaz explained what everybody knew. This was a packaged deal. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Oh, wait a minute. I'm not getting just land? Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Ha! Boaz is a slick man. He has a way with words. If someone was going to exercise the right of kinsman redeemer towards the deceased Elimelech, he had to fulfill the duty in regard to both the property and the family. Because of Boaz's wise and shrewd way of framing the occasion, this was the first time the nearer kinsman considered this, and it was a pretty big question to take it all in at once. When it was just a matter of property, he was down. He was ready. Absolutely. Let me get more land to share with my people and my family. But he must take on Ruth as his wife. That's another matter. Probably the man had grown sons that have already received their inheritance of their lands. The problem of dividing that inheritance among future children that he would have with Ruth would be more than he wanted to deal with. And probably the man was married and he knew it would be awkward to bring home another wife. Hi, honey. Guess what? So he says, take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. These were glorious words, music to the ears of Naomi and Ruth. A moment before, all seemed lost when the near kinsman said, I will redeem it. But Boaz's plan had a surprise and an unexpected wisdom to it, and it worked. God's plan unfolds. Boaz goes on to redeem the family, acquire the property, and to marry Ruth. Just as Ruth was loyal to Naomi back in chapter 1, now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. Here we see the reversal of the tragedy of chapter 1, the death of a husband and sons back then, to Ruth getting married and having a new son in chapter 4, which Scripture says is a joy to Naomi. The symmetry is remarkable. The loyalty of Ruth to Naomi in chapter 1 is matched by Boaz's loyalty that leads to the family's restoration and redemption. How perfectly imperfect, huh? Tragedy becomes triumph. The good was found through the faithful. And if you notice, cool fact, you've probably heard this before, God was not mentioned throughout the entire book. I didn't say anything about him as I told you the story. But if you read through every word, you're not going to see the mention of God. God's providence and sovereignty is working throughout its entirety, but he's never mentioned. He's never talked about. The story is all about the family being redeemed. Naomi thought that God was punishing her, and yet the story proved that he was working all along to restore her family through the heart, faith, and love of her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the Moabite, who knew nothing of who God was until she became part of the family. Perfectly imperfect. God's purposes and will, interwoven with our purposes and decisions and will. The faithful obedience of his people brings about his purpose of redemption for the world. Let me say that again. The faithful obedience of his people, that's us, brings about his purpose of redemption for the world. He works through us to bring his children home. That's what it's all about. And that leads us to the end of the book, where we see the ultimate reasons for how this story plays out. God's intentions all along. Now, These are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Oh. The son of Boaz and Ruth, Obed, is King David's grandfather. Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David. And David and Ruth are in the direct bloodline of King Jesus. This incredible story of redemption leads to the opportunity of redemption for the entire world. This was a foreshadow of the work of King Jesus. This is a lesson for all of us to learn how Jesus truly works in us and among us. Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. That is why he became a man. God might have sent an angel to save us, but the angel would not have been our kinsman. Jesus, in his eternal glory, without the addition of humanity to his divine nature, might have saved us, but he wouldn't have been our kinsman. A great prophet or priest would have been our kinsman, but his own sin would have disqualified him from being our redeemer. Only King Jesus, the eternal God who added humanity to his eternal deity, can be both the kinsman and the redeemer for all of mankind. And this is why we are secure in his grasp. Regardless of what you're going through, the good times or the bad, the ordinary and the heartbreaking, if you are a child of God, he will work all things to the good. The joy, the success, the growth, the pain, the ODs, the bankruptcies, the divorces, the diagnoses, no matter what you're going through, God is working. No matter what is happening, God is in the background and he is seamlessly tying all things together. You may not feel it, you may not hear it, you may not see it, you may not understand it, but he is weaving all things together. He is working all things for the good. So trust him. Trust our kinsman redeemer who came to save us, to redeem us, to restore us to the purposes of our Father God. Stand firm in your faith. Stay rooted in the word and the promises of God and find the good. Through your imperfect, your perfect God is calling you home and saying, trust me, I got you. Look for the good.